As Adam said, the topic tonight is ape-men, ancestors and Adam, and the subtitle is Making Sense of the Hominin Fossil Record. I'll explain what I mean by a hominin in a few moments. So we're really thinking here about human origins and the early history of humanity, and particularly with a focus on the fossil record, which is my own sort of area of interest. It's the part of geology that I really specialized in when I did my postgraduate work. So let's begin by thinking first of all about the two sort of main models of human origins. First of all, there's the biblical model, and according to the Bible, God in the beginning supernaturally created the first two people, Adam and Eve. Adam was made from the dust of the ground. Eve was made from his side. There's no hint in the biblical text of previous ancestry. They were supernaturally created by God, and they were unique. They were distinct from the animals in at least two ways. One is that they were made in the image of God, unlike any of the other creatures that God made. And secondly, humanity was given dominion over all of the other creatures that God had made, something that obviously can't be said of any other creature. So according to the biblical record, we were supernaturally created, and we are unique and distinct from all of the other creations that God made. Now, of course, this is in stark contrast to the conventional evolutionary view, which says that human beings evolved in Africa somewhere around 3 to 4 million years ago from ape-like ancestors who evolved upright walking as an efficient way of moving around the African grasslands, the African plains. And today, many Christians, even many professing evangelicals, have been seeking to harmonize this evolutionary account of human origins with the biblical account. And at least part of the reason why they feel compelled to do this is because they've become convinced that the scientific evidence demands it, that the scientific evidence for the evolutionary story of human origins is overwhelming. So what I want to do in the talk this evening is to have a closer look at some of this scientific evidence, as I say, with a particular focus on what we can learn from fossils. We could, of course, also consider evidence from genetics, but I'm not going to do that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think we have limited time, and I don't think we could do justice to all of the fossil data and the genetic data really in a single talk. And also because the genetics isn't really my discipline, so it's a bit further away from my own particular area of interest. So I want to focus particularly on the fossil record. And I want to ask, as we look at the fossil record, whether the evolutionary story is the best explanation, the best interpretation of what we see in the fossil record. So the outline of the talk is basically, firstly, I want to begin with a kind of overview, a survey of the hominin fossil record. The word hominin is really, I'm using it here as a kind of catch-all term to mean all of the fossil creatures that we're going to look at. So they could be human, or they might be non-human, but we're going to call them all hominins. It's just a scientific term that kind of encompasses all of these particular fossil creatures. And of course, we're interested in which are human and which are non-human. And after we've surveyed the data, mostly kind of descriptive, then I want to begin to sort of look at how we interpret these things. And I want to introduce something called barominology. Barominology is essentially the study of the created kinds. And some work has been done over the last 10 years or so to apply the techniques, the methods of barominology to the fossil hominins. And I want to survey some of the results from that work and see what that can tell us. And then I want to move into a creationist interpretation of the hominin fossil record, bearing in mind the data that we've looked at and the barominology work that we've looked at, and suggest how the hominin fossil record fits into the picture of the recovery of the world after the global flood in the days of Noah. And then at the end, I just want to think about some of the implications of all of this information, all of this data. Firstly, for the creationist model of origins, what are some of the particular implications for our creationist understanding of origins? And then secondly, what are some of the implications for the debate that's currently raging within the Christian and evangelical world about the historical Adam? So that's basically the outline of the talk. So let's begin then with a survey of the hominin fossil record. And in order to understand some of the challenges that the hominin fossil record presents to us, first of all, we need to consider some of the major differences between modern humans and modern apes before we begin to look at the fossils. All modern humans belong to a single species, Homo sapiens, and it's relatively easy, I think, to compile a list of the character traits that differentiate between modern humans, modern Homo sapiens, and all of the modern apes, such as chimps and gorillas and so on. So, for example, modern humans have a relatively large brain. They have a skull with a high forehead, a flat face, and without much of a with a prominent chin. Whereas if you look at an ape, obviously an ape has a much smaller brain capacity, but it also has a face that has a jaw that juts out. They don't have much of a chin. They don't have much of a forehead. There are other significant differences. The foramen magnum, which is the hole where the spinal cord meets the brain, has a different position in modern humans compared to modern apes, and we'll think about some of the implications of that a bit later. There are differences in the structure of the pelvis and the spine. We obviously have an anatomy that is designed for upright walking, for upright locomotion, whereas the apes are basically animals that walk on all fours or move around in the trees. And we have anatomy that reflects that. So we have relatively long legs and relatively short arms compared to an ape, which has relatively long arms and relatively short legs. There are differences in the structure of the pelvis. The foot is quite different in apes. Obviously, apes have a grasping big toe, so the foot is more like a hand. So there are some very obvious and significant differences between modern humans and modern apes. And I think if all we had were living creatures, then it would be fairly easy to argue for a very substantial difference, a very substantial discontinuity between these groups, humans on the one hand and apes on the other. However, since the 1850s, a whole series of fossils have been found. And in many of these fossils, we seem to see a combination of character traits that we find in modern humans and in modern apes. And we find those combined in one fossil creature. So one of the first of these fossil creatures to be discovered were the Neanderthals. There were some early discoveries of Neanderthal fossils in the 1830s and in the 1840s, although the significance of them wasn't really recognized. It was really in 1856 with the discovery of a skeleton in the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf in Germany, that the Neanderthals really came to the forefront of people's thinking. And today we know a lot about the Neanderthals. They're very well represented in the hominin fossil record. They're generally considered a separate species from modern humans. Some people have suggested they might be a subspecies, but they're generally put into a different species, Homo neanderthalensis, Neanderthal man. Their fossil remains are quite widespread across Europe and the Middle East and parts of Asia. And among all of the fossil hominins that we're going to think about in the talk this evening, the Neanderthals are the ones that resemble modern humans the most closely. We know that they lived alongside modern humans. And in fact, we've even been able to sequence from fossil bones the Neanderthal genome. And we know that modern Homo sapiens, people, virtually everybody who lives outside of southern Africa, has a small component of Neanderthal DNA. So we know that they were interbreeding with us, that they contributed to our genome. And in fact, we also have evidence from the genetic material that's been sequenced from fossils that the Neanderthals were indeed hybridizing with modern humans, with Homo sapiens. Now, if you look at the Neanderthal in that last slide, you'll have noticed that it looks very, very like a modern human. Certainly from the neck down, they're perhaps more robustly built, but otherwise very similar to modern humans. But when you look at their skulls are actually strikingly different to those of a modern human. So we have a Neanderthal here on the right and a modern human on the left. And some of the differences that you might notice are that the Neanderthal has this very long, low skull. It has a receding forehead, somewhat different from the high forehead of a modern human. There are prominent ridges over the eyes, these large sort of brow ridges. The face juts out somewhat more than a modern human, and they had very broad noses. They had a larger nasal cavity. There's not much of a chin. If you think about the chin of a modern human, the Neanderthals didn't really have much of a chin. The brain capacity actually in the Neanderthals was on average larger than in modern humans. And that's partly because they had this expanded area at the back of the skull called the occipital bun. And that meant that the brain cavity was actually somewhat larger on average than in modern humans. So the Neanderthals, although they look very similar to us, certainly from the neck down, there are some distinct differences in terms of the skull. Now, we also have important cultural artifacts associated with the Neanderthals. There are grave sites that indicate that the Neanderthals were purposely burying their dead, probably with some ceremony. We know that they made sophisticated stone tools. There's a stone tool culture associated with the Neanderthals called the Mousterian culture, and they made other tools from bone and even ornaments using teeth and shells and so on. We know that they used red ochre for pigmentation, and there are even artifacts that have been interpreted as Neanderthal art, Neanderthal sculptures and so on. So there's a lot of cultural evidence that indicates that the Neanderthals are basically humans. They have some physical differences from modern humans, but in most other respects, physically and culturally, they appear very, very human-like. Well, after the Neanderthals were discovered in the 1850s, in the 1890s, a Dutch geologist, Eugene Dubois, discovered another important fossil hominin on the Indonesian island of Java. Today, we call this fossil creature, Homo erectus, or upright man. And you can see a Homo erectus skull from Java on the left in this slide. We found since then many other specimens of Homo erectus in other parts of the world. And in Africa, we have Homo erectus-like fossils. In Africa, they're called Homo ergaster, which are very similar, but differ somewhat in details of the skull. They both had relatively large brain sizes, somewhat smaller than modern humans, but on average, but generally quite large brains. A nearly complete skeleton of a juvenile Homo ergaster was discovered in Kenya in 1984, and you can see the skeleton on the right in this slide, and then the skull in more close up. Again, I think you can see that certainly from the neck down, this Homo ergaster fossil looks extremely human-like. You would probably have to be quite an expert to be able to tell glance. However, again, there are differences of detail in the skulls. Like the Neanderthals, erectus had an ergaster had these sloping foreheads, these brow ridges over the eyes, a more projecting face, a less pronounced chin, and so on. They also had a kind of an enlarged area at the back of the skull, but in this case, it was actually just a kind of bony projection. So overall, the brain size is a bit lower than modern humans. We don't have any evidence with erectus or ergaster of intentional burial so far. I wouldn't be surprised if we find something like that in the future, but we don't have any evidence of it so far. But based on the studies of their teeth, we do know that they cooked food, and we know that they made stone tools. There's a stone tool culture associated with erectus called the Acheulean culture. So we have the Neanderthals, and then we've got the erectus-like fossils, and then we've got a diverse group of other hominins known as Australopithecines. Australopithecines, or Australopithecus, the genus name, simply means southern ape. And the first discovery of an Australopithecine was in the 1920s, 1924, when the anthropologist Raymond Dart received a shipment of fossils that had been excavated at a place called Taung in South Africa. And among those fossils was the partial skull and brain casts that you can see on the left of a juvenile Australopithecine, which Raymond Dart named Australopithecus africanus, the southern ape from Africa. Well, since then, several other important Australopithecus discoveries have been made in other parts of South Africa and East Africa. The East African Australopithecines have been called Australopithecus afarensis, after the Afar region of Ethiopia. And they include the famous Lucy skeleton, which you can see on the right in this slide. This is a 40% complete female skeleton that was discovered by a team led by the anthropologist Don Johansen in 1974. Now, when we look at Australopithecine skulls, they are very different to modern human skulls. The faces are very sloping with projecting muzzles. The teeth and the jaws are often much larger. The brain cavities are much smaller. They're in the kind of range of chimpanzee and gorilla. There are two broad types of Australopithecine. There are the slender or gracile forms that you can see on the left, and then there are the more robust forms represented by this creature called Paranthropus on the right. And when you look at the rest of the skeleton, likewise, it's very ape-like in many respects. So the forearms are proportionally very long. when compared to modern humans. So in many ways, they're very, very ape-like. So why are they considered relevant then to the question of human ancestry? Why do evolutionists think that they're hominins on the human line? Well, one of the things that marks out hominins from all other primates is the ability to walk upright on two legs, the ability to walk bipedally. And several features of the Australopithecine skeleton are said to indicate that these creatures were able to walk upright, although in a fashion very different from a modern human being. So the first piece of evidence that is suggested to point to bipedal walking is the position of the foramen magnum, the hole in the skull that we mentioned earlier, where the spinal cord meets the brain. Now, if you look at a modern ape skull, the hole in the skull is angled at the back of the skull. And if you think about the fact that apes are quadrupedal, they walk around on all fours, you can understand why. They need a hole at the back of the skull so that when they're walking around on all fours, their face is pointing forwards so that they can see where they're going. Whereas in modern humans, the hole in our skull is actually at the base of the skull. So our skull just sits directly on top of the spinal column. And of course, that allows us to be able to see forwards when we're walking around on two legs. And when we look at Australopithecine skulls, we find that the location, the position of the hole in their skull is actually at the base of the skull, much more like the position in a modern human than in a modern ape. So this is said to be a piece of evidence that they walked upright like us. Another line of evidence concerns the shape of the pelvis, the hip bones. If you look at modern apes, the two blades of the pelvis are basically oriented so they're flat against the back, whereas in modern humans, the pelvic bones form a kind of bowl shape, which helps to support our internal organs when we're standing upright. And when we look at Australopithecines, again, we see that the pelvis has this sort of bowl shape, much more like that of a modern human than a modern ape. A third piece of evidence for upright walking in the Australopithecines concerns the angle of the femur, the thigh bone, the upper bone of the leg. If you look at the thigh bone in modern apes, it basically is straight. It meets the knee with no angle at all. This allows apes to walk with their hind legs apart and gives them stability as they walk around on all fours. Whereas in modern humans, we have an angled femur. The thigh bone is angled inwards so that our knees are close together directly underneath our body. And this is a design that gives us stability when we're walking around upright on two legs. And again, when we look at Australopithecine thigh bones, they appear to have this angle so that the femur is angled inwards, rather like a modern human. And then one final piece of evidence that the Australopithecines were capable of upright walking concerns the structure of the foot. We mentioned earlier that in modern apes, we have this opposable big toe. So the toe is more like a thumb. It's able to grasp. And of course, this is a design for being able to move around in trees. The foot lacks an arch and the heel is small. When you compare that to a modern human, we obviously don't have opposable big toes. Our toes are aligned. We do have an arched foot. The heel is much larger. And in Australopithecines, what we find is that the toes are somewhat aligned. They're not completely aligned in the way that a human's toes are aligned, but they're much more aligned than a modern ape. there is an arch to the foot and the heel is larger than in a typical ape. So if we put all of this information together, you know, they kind of build this case that the Australopithecines look as though they were able to walk around on two legs, at least for some of the time, and perhaps in a manner different to that of modern humans. Well, besides the well-known groups of hominins that we've already looked at, there are a number of other species which are known from the fossil record, but known from more fragmentary fossil material. For example, there are a number of other species of Australopithecine. One of them that was discovered relatively recently was Australopithecus sediba, that was discovered in the so-called cradle of mankind in South Africa in 2008. It's represented by two partial skeletons, a male and a female, comprising more than 200 individual bones. And there is a well-preserved skull, which you can see on the right. Now, one of the striking things about Australopithecus sediba is that it is the most human-like of the Australopithecines that have been described. The teeth are rather small for an Australopithecine. They're much more like human teeth. It has a rather human-like face. The brow ridges are not so prominent. Aspects of the pelvis and leg bones and so on are also quite human-like. It has a relatively small brain, but looking at the interior of the skull, the brain looks as if it's organized in quite an advanced fashion. So it's a strange combination of traits that we might associate with, you know, perhaps some ape-like traits, and then other traits that are much more human-like. Another group of fossil creatures represented by more fragmentary material is sometimes lumped together and called early Homo, early members of our genus, early Homo. And because the material is fragmentary, you often get quite sort of lively debates about how to interpret it. And here in this slide, you can see two quite well-known skulls, famous skulls, particularly the one on the right, 1470, that was discovered in 1972 by Richard Leakey. Then on the left, you've got this other skull, 1813. And for a long time, there was debate about these two skulls. Were they two separate species? One called Homo habilis on the left, Homo rudolfensis on the right. Or were they just two varieties of Homo habilis? There was a lot of debate about this. And it was really with the discovery of other skulls, other skull material that resembles 1470, the skull on the right, that some clarity came to this question, because it turned out that, in fact, the skull 1813 on the left fell outside the range of variation of the 1470 type skulls. So it does look as if they are actually distinct species and not just varieties of a single species. But it does highlight for us a lesson, which is that, you know, where we have lots of specimens, where we have a lot of fossil material, the Neanderthals, for example, then obviously we can be much more confident in some of the things that we say about these fossils. Where we have much more fragmentary material, then obviously our conclusions have to be a lot more tentative, and there's almost inevitable disagreement among experts. Now, remarkable discoveries have continued to be made, and one of the most remarkable was a series of discoveries made at a site called Dmanisi, which is in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. And archaeologists here were actually excavating a small village, relatively small, compact site. But when they got below the level at which they were sort of excavating this village, they got into much older deposits. and they actually found what has turned out to be one of the richest hominin fossil sites anywhere in the world. And it's caused an immense amount of discussion because the fossils that were found there have proved to be very difficult to classify. You can see at the bottom of this slide these 5 skulls or partial skulls that were all found in effectively the same horizon, the same layer at Dmanisi. So they're all about the same, they're all basically the same age. They're all living there in one very tiny area. And yet these skulls are so different from one another. You know, if you found them in different layers within the sediments, or if you found them at different locations, you would be sorely tempted to put these into different species. But that doesn't seem possible. I mean, you can't have 5 different hominin species all coexisting at the same time in one tiny site. So what do we make of them? Some have argued that these are all varieties of one species, perhaps a variety of Homo erectus. Some have said they should be assigned to a new species, Homo georgicus. They're very remarkable and very hard to classify, very hard to interpret. But the diversity is interesting, and it might be interesting from a creationist perspective. So, you know, I'll mention that again a bit later. Another dramatic discovery that was announced to the world in 2015 was an exceptional treasure trove of hominin fossils that were found in a cave system, the Rising Star cave system near Johannesburg in South Africa. This cave system is extremely hard to get into. You have to go down some very narrow passageways. There's a single cave entrance, and you go down these twisting, very narrow passageways. In fact, the scientists had to send down their smallest graduate students into the cave in order to be able to recover the fossils. There's also a drop, a 12-meter vertical shaft that takes you down into the actual chamber where the fossils were originally discovered. But what's remarkable is the abundance of fossil material in this site. There are more than 1,500 bones from at least 15 individuals, actually probably far more, representing both males and females and a range of ages of individuals. Now, how did they get there? How did these fossil remains get into this cave? Well, another one of the remarkable things about this site is that the fossils appear to have been deliberately placed there. They were deliberately taken into the cave. There's absolutely no evidence consistent with the idea that they were washed in. There's no other entrance, even though the scientists have looked for another entrance into the cave. It looks as if there's only that one entrance that you can get into. There's no evidence that it was once a hyena den or anything of that kind. These bones are not mixed with other bones that would be prey animals. So the remarkable conclusion they came to is that this was a deliberate grave site. This was a deliberate cemetery, that these hominin fossils had been, these hominin remains had been deliberately taken into the cave in complete darkness. They must have used artificial light. They must have used fire or torches to sort of negotiate their way into this place. But it looks as if it was purposeful burial. And in fact, when you look at the age profile of the remains in the cave, they have the age profile of a cemetery. You know, if you go to a graveyard, you'll find that there are lots of very young individuals, you know, individuals who died, you know, at a very young age. And then you'll find that there are lots of older individuals and a bit of a gap in the age range in between. And that's exactly what we find in these fossils in this cave. What's also remarkable is that the fossils are so similar. You know, we have multiple bones So we can compare bones from different individuals, and they are so similar that, in fact, not only are these all members of a single species, they're probably all members of a single wider family. They appear to be extremely closely related because of the extreme similarity of the traits of the bones. So it's really remarkable. So these remarkable hominin fossils have been named as a new hominin species called Homo naledi by Lee Berger, the anthropologist who has discovered this creature. He named it Homo naledi. And again, this hominin is a strange combination of human-like and more ape-like features. So in overall body form and the overall appearance of the skull, it looks quite human. The hands and wrists, the long legs, aspects of the feet, all very human. And yet the brain size is quite small. It has a very unusual flared shoulder blades, a strange shaped pelvis. It has rather long fingers. So again, it has these sort of somewhat ape-like traits, and yet in many respects looks very human-like. And in fact, Homo naledi and the Rising Star Cave System has continued to throw up surprises. This, by the way, is a photo that I took in 2016 with Lee Berger, who is the discoverer of Australopithecus sediba and of Homo naledi. He was giving a lecture at my alma mater, and I was able to go to the lecture and managed to get this selfie with him. Yeah, it continues to throw up surprises. Scientists who looked at the anatomy of Homo naledi thought that it looked most like early Homo. And so they thought this would turn out to be very old, that these Homo naledi remains could turn out to be something like 2.5 to 3 million years old. But actually in May 2017, they announced that they had dated the cave deposits. Now, bearing in mind, these are conventional dates. So I, as a young age creationist, I don't accept these dates at all. But these are the dates that they came up with. And the dates they came up with for the cave deposits were between 236 and 335,000 years ago. That is remarkably recent. So, this was a complete surprise, because what we have is what looks like a very archaic hominin, and yet a very, very recent date. This is just yesterday in geological terms. Further burial chambers have also been discovered in the cave system, which are also full of fossil material. So this is a really incredible location. So that kind of brings us up to date with some of the major fossil discoveries, and I've tried to sort of keep interpretation at this point to a minimum, but just kind of describe to you what the data is that we have. But we need to think then about how these things are interpreted. What do they mean? And of course, usually all of these hominin fossils are interpreted from an evolutionary perspective. So the various hominin species are assumed to have shared a common ancestor that lived in the past, and to have diversified through evolutionary processes. And so all of these species are typically arranged on a single evolutionary tree, somewhat like the one that I've reconstructed here, which is said to demonstrate their evolution through time. And broadly speaking, the conventional dates which are given to these fossils kind of fit this overall picture. So we have Australopithecines that are about 4 million years old, early Homo, Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, maybe 2.5 to 3 million years ago. We have Homo erectus and ergaster somewhere around 2 million years ago. And then we have younger hominins, Neanderthals and so on. Now, Not all of the data fits that nice, neat picture. We've already said that Homo naledi rather confounds this this picture. But nevertheless, this is the kind of evolutionary interpretation that is usually placed on the data. Of course, as a creationist, I have all kinds of questions I want to ask about this. And one of the things that I want to know as a creationist is, you know, if the Bible is correct, as I believe it to be, and humans and non-humans, humans and apes, had separate origins. In other words, they can't be traced back to a common ancestor. Then I want to know which of these fossils are truly human and which are non-human. And that's a very important question. I want to know, is there some way that we can distinguish between the truly human and the non-human? And if I want to answer that question, the truth is I can't use the conventional methods of classification. The conventional methods of taxonomy and classification assume common ancestry. It's built into the method. The evolutionist asks the question, how are these creatures related? But he doesn't ask, are they related to one another? He doesn't ask that question, and his method is not set up to answer the question of whether these creatures truly are related to one another. They can only answer the question of, if they are related to one another, how do they relate to one another? So in other words, if I want to answer the kind of questions I have as a creationist, then I need other methods. I can't rely on these evolutionary methods of classification. And so this is where I want to introduce the creationist discipline known as barominology. So barominology is a word that is derived partly from words in the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew bara, which means create, and min, which means kind. So barominology is the study of the created kinds. The word baromin, to mean a created kind, was first coined in 1941 by a creationist biologist called Frank Lewis Marsh. And since Marsh's time, barominology has developed into a whole discipline. It was first really formalized by Dr. Kurt Wise in 1990 as a new creationist discipline, a method for classifying and categorizing species into their created kinds. And the way it works is that barominologists try to home in on the created kinds by looking for overall similarities and differences. So we're trying to find out which creatures really belong together, which have similarities that are such that they cluster together and belong to the same kind, and which organisms cluster in different kinds, which are separated from one another by some kind of discontinuity and can therefore be placed in different kinds. So the great advantage of these methods is that they don't assume common ancestry like the evolutionary methods. And these methods basically work by what we might call successive refinement. So we can take bigger groups and we can find evidence to split them up into different kinds, or we can take smaller groups and find evidence that they actually belong to the same kind, and so we can put them together into larger groups. So by splitting up bigger groups and adding to smaller groups, the idea is that we kind of converge, we home in on what the original created kinds were. And one of the most interesting, innovative techniques that barominologists have developed is a set of statistical methods. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to get into lots of statistics here. I'm not going to try and bamboozle you with statistics, but basically, what these statistical methods do is that they statistically compare the morphology or the form of different species so that we can identify which belong in which created kinds. And this just kind of adds a bit of rigor to what we're doing, so that we actually have some statistical power, you know, to the conclusions that we're drawing. In order to carry out these kinds of analyses, we basically identify what are the distinct character traits that define particular species. So a character trait might be something like the number of toes on the hind foot, or it might be, you know, does this creature possess hair or scales or feathers, or it could be some structure of a bone or a particular feature of the skull. And because it's based on looking at morphology, the structure and form of the creature, it means that we can also apply it to fossils. We can not only apply it to living creatures, but we can also apply it to fossils as well. And the findings from our statistical analysis can then be plotted on a three-dimensional chart that helps us to visualize how the different species in our analysis clump together or are separated from one another. Now, to try and sort of bring this down to earth a bit, so you can visualize what we're talking about, here's an example that doesn't involve fossil hominins. So in this particular study, the researcher wanted to find out whether the different species of penguins belonged to a single created kind that was distinct from all other types of birds. So what the researcher did was he collected morphological data about all of these various species of penguins and a number of non-penguins, including the puffin, birds that are not penguins but are thought to be closely related to penguins. And all of that information went into the statistical program. And this illustration shows the kind of three-dimensional clustering that came out as a result. So the red dots on the left-hand side represent all of the different species of penguins in the analysis. Each dot is a different species. The yellow dots on the right represent the non-penguin species. And hopefully what you can see is that there is this very obvious discontinuity, this gap between the penguins on the left and the non-penguins on the right. In other words, there are no species that are bridging that gap. There are no species in the middle that are in some sense intermediate between penguins and non-penguins. There is a clear morphological gap, and that gap is statistically significant. It's really there, and you can detect it using these kinds of statistical analyses. So that's basically statistical barominology. Now, what happens? Here's a significant challenge for creationists. What happens if we seek to apply these kinds of statistical studies to the fossil hominins that we were thinking about earlier? And here's why it's such a challenge for creationists. Because in most of the cases that we've previously studied, about 70% of cases, statistical barominology suggests that all of the members of a biological family belong in a single created kind. So when we've done statistical barominology studies on cats, for example, it turns out that every member of the cat family, from lions and tigers to cheetahs to lynxes to pumas to domestic cats, they all appear to be members of a single created kind. And we find that families turn out to be to approximate the created kind in most cases. Now, here's the problem. Today, modern biologists classify humans apes, and Australopithecines all in the same family. So in other words, if we apply our statistical methods in this case, and it comes out that all the members of the family belong to a single kind, then that would be a problem for us, because it would mean that we would have to say that humans and apes and Australopithecines are all belong to the same kind. So that would be a problem. So it's very interesting. What do we find when we actually apply these methods? And of course, we have fossil hominins, as we've seen, that have strange combinations of traits, strange combinations of ape-like and human-like features. Are they going to turn out to be intermediate between humans, modern humans and modern apes? So this is a very significant test case for creationism. So let's think about what we would predict, okay, from the creationist model. If the creationist model is right, if the Bible is right, humans and apes were separately created, what would we expect to see? Well, I think firstly, we would expect to see a distinct human group that was distinct from all of the other animals. We should see a human group. And I think in that group, we would expect to see Homo sapiens, our species. But I think as well, we'd expect to see Neanderthals and Homo erectus, because they look physically very like us and they have cultural traits that make them appear very human-like. So I think we'd expect there to be a human group with those hominins in it. I think we would expect to see at least one group of fossil apes that would include the Australopithecines. They are very ape-like in many respects. The robust and the slender Australopithecines would probably be in that non-human group. What about all of these other hominins which have these strange combinations of traits where perhaps we're scratching our head and saying, I don't know whether that's a human or that's an ape? And I'm thinking of things like Homo habilis, Homo naledi, maybe even Australopithecus sediba. Well, my prediction as a creationist would be that they should either fall into the human group and therefore be classified as humans, or they should fall into the ape group, okay, and be classified as apes. What we wouldn't expect is that they would occupy some kind of intermediate position between humans and apes. That would be something that I think would find to be very unexpected. So these are the predictions I would make. So what did we find? Well, beginning in about 2010, a number of barominology studies have now been published applying these kinds of methods that we've talked about to a whole range of fossil hominins. The first study was published in the Answers Research Journal, published by Answers in Genesis 2010, written by Dr. Todd Wood. And he followed that up with another study in 2016, where he reanalyzed the data set from 2010, but he added a whole lot of new information as well, some additional information into that data set. And a number of other studies have been published since that help to sort of reinforce and confirm the results from these initial studies. Okay, so what did they find? Well, here is one of the results of one of the data sets in the 2016 study. And again, we're looking at these colored dots. Remember the penguins? We're looking here at colored dots where the yellow dots represent the members of our genus, Homo. You can see Homo sapiens is there among them. And then we've got some red dots and green dots and blue dots. The red and the green dots are Australopithecines, and the blue dots are the modern apes, so chimps and gorillas. And hopefully what you can see is that there is a discontinuity between this cluster of yellow dots, the human cluster, and the other species in the analysis. And again, that is a statistically significant discontinuity, a gap that is unfilled, unbridged by hominin fossils. So that's encouraging. We're seeing discrete groups, distinct groups, a human group and ape-like groups. Here's another one of the data sets. I think in the 2010 study, there were about 8 different data sets that were studied. We'll just look at a couple. Again, you've got the yellow dots that represent the members of our genus Homo. The green and the red dots are the Australopithecines, and the blue dots, the modern apes. And again, there is a statistically significant discontinuity between them. Now, one thing I do just want to point out in this analysis, and this was something that was consistently found in all of the analyses, I want you to notice that there is one green dot, an Australopithecine, on the human side of that gap. And which Australopithecine is that? That is Australopithecus sediba. I'll come back to that in just a moment, but just for the moment, kind of ponder that for a moment. So what are we seeing in these barominology studies? Well, to sum up, we are consistently finding in all of the data sets that we've studied so far that we find a clear and obvious human group that is separated by a morphological gap, a discontinuity from non-humans, from the apes. And we're finding that this is a consistent result that we can recover from multiple data sets. Those questionable species, you know, the ones where we perhaps scratching our heads, they either fall into the human group or they fall into the non-human group. We don't find intermediate forms that bridge the gap between these major groups. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, one perhaps the most unusual result, perhaps the one that causes people to the most surprise, is that Australopithecus sediba falls in the human group, not in the non-human group. But I want to just remind you of something I said earlier. Sediba is the most human-like of all of the fossils that have been classified as an Australopithecine. And it is possible, I think, that it has been misclassified, that in fact it is a member of the genus Homo and not really an Australopithecine at all. So that's certainly a possibility. Another possibility is that there is just something very strange about the data sets that we currently have available for Australopithecus sediba that's causing that one to fall in a strange place. But whatever is the solution to that particular puzzle, don't miss the big picture, which is that we have these major groups, humans and non-humans, and we can distinguish statistically between them. So how then do these fossil hominins fit into our overall creationist picture of early Earth history? Here you can see a simple geological column. I'm sure some of you are familiar with illustrations like this one showing the geological column, which is a kind of idealized composite representation of the rock layers that we find in the Earth's crust, with the older rock layers at the bottom and the younger rock layers at the top, and they're given all of these various technical names. Now, from a creationist perspective, we believe that some of these rock layers were formed before the worldwide flood in the days of Noah, these pre-flood sediments. Much of the fossil-bearing portion of the geological column we think represents layers that were deposited during the worldwide flood in the days of Noah. And then we have some rock layers at the top of the column that are thought to have been formed after the flood. Now, there is some disagreement among creationists as to exactly where the end of the flood occurs in the geological column in the fossil record, but this is roughly where I would put those boundaries. One of the things I want to point out here is that all of the fossil hominins that we've looked at in this talk are found in post-flood sediments. They are all in sediments that appear to have been deposited after Noah's flood. So this gives us a broad context in which we can interpret these things. When we study these human fossils, we're studying creatures that presumably were dispersing and filling the earth after the flood. So they were dispersing from the location of Noah's Ark, where it landed, and multiplying and filling the earth, whether humans or animals. So that's kind of the context in which we can interpret these fossils. And in fact, this biblical context actually helps us to explain something significant about these hominin fossils, which is the order in which they appear. We know that the more ape-like fossils appear earlier in the record than the more human-like fossils. So, for example, Lucy, one of the Australopithecines, appears earlier in the fossil record, but only later do we get the appearance of more human-like fossils like Homo erectus and Neanderthals. Well, how does the biblical account help us to explain this? Well, if you think about what the Bible says about what happened after the flood, when the animals came off the ark, they began to spread out from the location of the ark, and they began to multiply and to fill the earth. But the humans disobeyed God's command to spread out and to fill the earth. And the Bible tells us that they stayed together, and eventually they settled on the plain of Shinar and began to build the Tower of Babel. And it was only when God came down and confused their languages and confounded their building of the Tower of Babel that the humans began to spread out. So in other words, we would expect in the post-flood fossil record, we would expect ape-like fossils, animals, to turn up earlier in the record than the humans, because the humans don't begin to spread out and fill the earth until after the animals had already dispersed. So we can actually explain why these fossils appear in this sequence. And I think also the dispersal of humans from Babel helps us to explain the archaeological record of early humans. Imagine that you're one of those families or tribes spreading out from Babel. You are taking with you only a subset of human knowledge. You don't have all of the skills that the whole population has. How do you live? Well, you would probably revert to a fairly primitive technology, at least to begin with. You would perhaps begin to use stone tools to make tools from whatever materials you had around you. It wouldn't be until sometime after the recovery, after the flood, that you would be able to identify where there were deposits of metals and be able to mine them in order to produce metal tools. So we'd see a transition in the archaeological record from stone tools to metal tools. We'd also see a transition from hunter-gathering to agriculture. Those tribes spreading out from Babel would be living a kind of hand-to-mouth existence, hunting and gathering, migrating with their food sources, until finally they settle down and begin to develop agriculture and begin to develop the first post-flood cities. Shelter. Those early pioneers probably would have just had to take shelter where they could, in caves or in tents, and only later would they have settled down and begun to construct cities. And so again, this transition that we have from The old Stone Age to the new Stone Age and then beyond is one that makes sense in this context of post-flood recovery. Well, let's begin to draw the talk to a conclusion with just a brief discussion about some of the implications of the things that we've said so far. And firstly, I want to think about some of the implications for the creationist model itself. The first thing that I want to point out is that this research that I've talked about today, particularly the barominology research, should be a great encouragement to us as Bible-believing Christians, because it turns out that despite the significant challenge that these hominins seem to present for us, we really can apply robust scientific methods to distinguish between humans and non-humans. We can look at these fossils, study them statistically, looking at their morphology, and we really do find distinct groups. We don't find intermediates that bridge the gap between humans and non-humans. And to be honest, if fossil organisms like Homo naledi are not enough to bridge the gap between humans and non-humans, probably no other future fossil discovery is going to do it either. So that is something that should really encourage us. A second implication of this work, though, is that when we look at the human created kind, you know, all of the members that appear to be members of the human family, we notice that they're very diverse. The human family throughout the history of the world has been much more diverse in the past than it is today. I mean, today we see a great deal of diversity among humans, but it seems that the diversity was even greater in the past. Think about all of those skulls found at Dmanisi. You know, 5 skulls, all apparently living at about the same time in the same location, and yet very different from one another. One of the interesting things about the Dmanisi site is that it is quite old. It's the oldest hominin site outside of Africa, and it is only 200 miles as the crow flies from the traditional location of the Tower of Babel. It looks as if those early human populations spreading out from Babel were very, very diverse. You know, people like Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and so on, they did look a bit different from us. They had features of the skulls that we don't have, but they are all members of the human family, and as I said earlier, have contributed even to our modern genome. This leads on to a third implication, which is that just like other created kinds, humans, it seems, experience some kind of rapid diversification after the flood. We see evidence of this in other created groups, that when the animals came off the ark, they rapidly diversified into modern species and varieties. And it looks as if something similar happened to humans, that humans rapidly diversified into lots of different varieties that we can now recognize in the fossil record. And then fourthly, just very briefly, one other implication here, which is one perhaps for the archaeologist to ponder, is that if we're right in saying that Homo erectus, for example, is a descendant of Noah, and only, you know, his fossils only appear after humans were spreading out from Babel, that suggests that we have to be looking for the Tower of Babel much earlier in the archaeological record than most biblical archaeologists are used to doing. You know, most biblical archaeologists are looking for a Babylonian ziggurat sometime in the relatively, you know, in the ancient Near East, but relatively modern in the archaeological record. But this suggests that Babel actually probably is much earlier in the record than that. And then also a few implications briefly concerning the historical Adam debate. You know, I've mentioned earlier that there is this fierce debate raging through evangelicalism about whether Adam was a real historical person, and if so, was he ancestral to all humans? And even evangelicals are questioning these things today because they think that the science demands it, because they think that evolution is so solid that they have to reinterpret the biblical text. And I hope that what I've shown you is that actually there are very reasonable non-evolutionary interpretations of the scientific evidence. And if that's the case, then we do not have to reinterpret the biblical text and throw out traditional biblical teaching about Adam because of science. The science can be interpreted in a way that is fully consistent with the traditional view of Adam and Eve as ancestors of the whole of humanity in the recent past. However, a second point that I want to make, and this kind of follows on from that, is that one of the things that many of these evangelical scholars are doing is, I think they're looking for Adam and Eve in the wrong place, or rather the wrong time in the fossil record. They're mostly, when you read their books and their papers, they are mostly assuming that Adam and Eve were the parents of modern humans, modern Homo sapiens only. But if what I've said is correct this evening, then that assumption is wrong. We have to think of Adam and Eve as ancestral not only to modern humans, but to the Neanderthals and to Homo erectus as well. And that means that we would look for evidence of Adam and Eve in a very different place. And I think that's partly where some of these scholars are going wrong. This also has two other implications. Firstly, we have to reinterpret the conventional dates that are given to these fossils, because the Bible is very clear that Adam was created within the last few thousand years. And yet some of these fossils, which give every evidence of being the remains of descendants of Adam and Eve, are given ages of, you know, millions of years in some cases. And I think this tells us that we have to think again about those fossil dates. They are much too old, and they need to be reevaluated in light of the biblical information. And it also means that many of the genetics arguments, which we haven't looked at in the talk this evening, which are often used to argue against a historical Adam, those genetics arguments also need to be reconsidered in the light of what we've said this evening. Okay, so one final word, and then we're done, and we can start to sort of collate a few questions, hopefully, from you. Perhaps a more practical question that I just want to finish with. And the question is this: how will we respond the next time that we open our newspaper or we turn on the TV and there's some dramatic new discovery that's been made about human origins, some new discovery, some new hominin or something of that kind? In other words, what will we do when next we're presented with evidence that seems perhaps at first at face value to challenge our biblical worldview? And I want to suggest that when that happens, as it inevitably will, there are three things that we need to have in the forefront of our minds. The first is that we have to remember that science does not speak with the same clarity or authority as Scripture, and so we have to trust Scripture first. You know, we have general revelation in the creation, we have special revelation in the Bible, but the Bible is much clearer than general revelation. So let's trust the Bible. Remember, secondly, that the history of science is littered with discarded certainties. Theories come and go in science, in the history of science, and they mostly go. So always remember that other interpretations of the data, other theories and other models are possible. And we need to be diligent in looking for them. And then thirdly, remember, of course, that God is sovereign. You know, God was not taken by surprise when the scientists discovered Homo naledi in the Rising Star Cave. He knew those fossils were there. And so we should have confidence that the word of God is going to withstand any of these scientific discoveries. In fact, I think we should not be defensive about these discoveries. I think rather we should rejoice in them because they give us new insights into the creator God who we worship and the work that he has done in human history. And if we are diligent and apply ourselves carefully to the hard work and the critical thinking that we need to apply to these things, then I believe that new interpretations and new ways of interpreting these things are out there for us to discover. It's actually very exciting, I think. So that brings me to the end of my talk. Now, while our hosts are just having a look to see if there are some questions that have come in as I've been speaking, I just wanted to take a minute or so just to recommend a few resources that might be helpful to you, particularly if you want to dig a bit deeper into this particular topic. One book that I found quite helpful is the book on the left called What Happened in the Garden, edited by Abner Chu. It was published in 2016, and it's a multi-author book. There are two chapters in particular that are relevant to the topic this evening. There's chapter 2 of the book, which looks at the fossil record, gives a very good survey of the fossil data that we've looked at. I think the only major discovery that's really missing there is Homo naledi, because it was published just before Homo naledi was announced. But otherwise, it gives a very good overview of the fossil evidence. And then chapter 3 looks at the genetic arguments in a bit more detail, which we haven't looked at this evening. There's also a tremendous website called Human Genesis. It's humangenesis.org. It's an outreach of Core Academy of Science. Dr. Todd Wood, a good friend of mine, and he's put together this website with lots of helpful articles and blog posts and videos that really help to explain how we interpret the fossil and genetic data from a biblical perspective. So those are very helpful resources. My own book, The New Creationism, has a chapter on the human fossil record, although because the book was published in 2009, it actually came out before all of the barominology work was done that I've talked about this evening. So when I do a revised edition, I will make sure that's included. One other resource that you might like to know about is a new podcast that Dr. Todd Wood, who did all of the barominology work we've been talking about. I've known Todd for about 20 years or so, and he and I recently launched a new podcast called Let's Talk Creation. It's basically just designed to be a kind of informal conversational style program where we talk about all kinds of topics, science and faith and creation, evolution, and biblical studies. We are putting out a new episode every fortnight. We've currently just released our 4th episode, which is an interview with Thomas Purifoy, who was the man behind the Is Genesis History movie that many of you may have seen. And I'd encourage you to go and check out the podcast. All of the various streaming options are available at coresci.org/podcast. It's on YouTube as well as all of the regular podcast platforms. And do go and give us a review and a like and share it and tell your friends and subscribe. That would help us greatly. And then finally, there are the details of how you can contact Biblical Creation Trust, which is the organization that I work for. There's our website, biblicalcreationtrust.org. Do go and have a look at our website. You can sign up on the website to receive our regular prayer letter, which we send out 3 times a year. You can either get it by email or through the post. We also send out a monthly email with news just to keep you up to date in between prayer letters, and we're very happy to sign you up for that. And we also are quite active on Facebook, so if you have a Facebook account, do go and like our page, and you'll keep in touch with us through that means as well.